Hi, Willie Ocasio. Congratulations on your OMT Distinguished Scholar Award, and thank you so much for making time to talk.
I'm excited about the interview, and I was just thrilled, and I was certainly not expecting the award, so it was fantastic. But I'm very honored.
That's wonderful. So I thought we would start out by talking a little bit about your theory of attentional control that you outlined in your acceptance speech. So to start our conversation, I was hoping you could describe the concept of attentional control and discuss how it's central to organizational processes.
Okay, maybe I'm gonna step back a little to put this in context, right? Because the way, particularly from the context of the presentation that I did in my speech, attentional control, I see it as a theory that is that's able to unify different perspectives, right? Even within attention and thought that cut across attention, right? And it is derived from initially from actually work at the neuroscience level, right? Where neuroscientists have discovered that attention in the brain is actually multiple different things, right? There is attention like about which is called orientation. If you're looking at something, you see certain things and not others. That's the classic gorilla experiment, for instance, which I mentioned in the speech, right? There's attention and vigilance, your ability to move about, which there's some of that in the gorilla experiment also. But attentional control is the ability of humans to take different information, both information, things that they're in the immediate information, and combine it with other information that they have in their brains from less memory, and then decide, okay, I'm going to focus on certain things to the exclusion of others. And focus on certain things might be more than just one or two, right? But obviously, to focus, we can't, we're not going to be able to look all the information that we have. And Herbert Simon has this famous quote about, I'm probably going to get it wrong right now, but in an era there's all this surplus of information, it's the scarcity of attention or the poverty of attention that's a problem, right? So attentional control is really about, yes, given all the potential information that might be available, or in terms of organizational behavior, more explicitly, all the action alternatives that might be available to consider in a situation, or all the particular criteria to evaluate alternatives, all the issues, opportunities, and threats. We don't have the capacity to control all of them, right? To pay attention to all of them, excuse me. But then there are different mechanisms at different levels of analysis that basically shape that we are actually able then to focus on certain things, not on others. And rather than think about attention as a purely individual level phenomena, which is something that sometimes people think about, and even in my work in attention-based view, that's not what I meant, but sometimes people interpret it that way, that it is about thinking about how this attentional control is actually a cross-level phenomenon, right? Yes, there's attentional control that exists at the individual level, but we as individuals are part of groups, part of organizations, part of organizational fields, etc. Right? So our attentional control is not just something that happens in our brain; it's something that happens because we're social creatures, we're organizational creatures, right? So this is the idea of linking across different levels of analysis this concept of attentional control, and I'm using it somewhat, the precision of use of the term across different levels. So it's not exactly the same, right? So we have to be a little careful. But I think that the way that they are come together is, in fact, there's always a selected number of features of the actions and the issues that can be attended at any moment in time. Mm-hmm. But then this is actually we have some control over that as individuals. Well, that control over as individuals is shaped for things that include who our managers are, right? That shape our attention, right? What organization we're part of, what field that we're part of, what society do we belong to, and a lot of these things are taken for granted, right? But part of then this theory of attentional control suggests that it's kind of this cross-level and multi-level theory is that what individuals the leader's ability to shape their attention is shaped by how the managers themselves, constrain and enable the attention, and then organizations and institutions, right? And this is what I talked about: institutional, managerial, and organizational and managerial attention. And then I added algorithms, right? Because I think in the modern age, we're actually being attentional control is shaped immensely by algorithms, right? Even in the pre-AI world, right? All the information in the digital transformation. Like I think I made a joke about Apple controls my attention, right? All the different technologies are available. Sometimes remarkably, like my photos, I'm totally disorganized by my photos. Here's not Apple, but Google Photos, right? They're making me pay attention to certain photos and not others, right? And they don't control it completely, right? Because I can decide I'm going to look at this or not, but it prioritizes, right? And by the way, I think one of your questions had to do with how the influence of algorithms and AI might have affected how I'm thinking about this. And one aspect that is particularly important from that research is actually the focus on prioritization, which is a word that I hadn't really used very much before. Because what these algorithms in artificial intelligence do is actually prioritize relationships among words, and then in a stochastic model, right? And it's not that it's a 0-1. That this absolutely will give you, always the same thing, but it establishes particular priorities about what is more likely or less likely to be interpreted a particular set of words, a particular phrase, etc. Right? So thinking about attentional control as prioritization among multiple difference, right? We could, for something from 0 to 1, we can think about it, or depending on your scale, it could be 0 from infinity. But it's establishing priorities of what being attended to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love your discussion of algorithms as powerful attentional control mechanisms. I think that is a great way of thinking about them and why they have such a big impact on so many domains of social life today. So I was hoping to dig in a little bit to the centrality of cross-level analysis to this theory and to your approach more broadly. Throughout the talk, you stressed the importance of cross-level analysis, and I was wondering if you have any examples, either from your own work or from other work, of people who really deal successfully with thinking across levels, because it can be quite challenging, I think. And so if you have any illustrations in mind that could be models, particularly for younger scholars.
Well, I think, one thing about the publication process is that it kind of forces you to focus on certain things and not on others. Talk about attentional control, right? Your reviewers exercise attentional control over you, right? So sometimes what is put in the foreground of a paper doesn't illustrate all the background that is happening in the where you're actually studying. So I think one of the things I was trying to say during my speech that, in fact, first of all, I think attentional control is basically in maybe not everything paper that I've done, but in almost everyone, right? Although it's hidden, right? It's in the background, right? And partly it's in the background because partly I tend to focus on certain levels of analysis. But in fact, if you dig deeper, these are cross-level studies. So, for instance, of my empirical work, the most highly cited one is, the paper with Thornton and Ocasio, right, 1999. Well, that's an institutional logics paper, and logics are at the industry level, but not really in a way, because what our unit of analysis is actually the organization, right? It's not the industry, right? So it's how that from what I would say, it's like, from the way that I would characterize it, how the shifts in attentional control over time affect the attentional control at the level of the individual organizations. And by the way, those are hazard rates, right? And if you think about hazard rates, it's also about it's also, you can think about it from a prioritization perspective, right? What's the likelihood that something is going to happen more than other times, right? So I think this is kind of a very clear example, even though it was, yeah, but it was written for the American Journal of Sociology, so we didn't kind of highlight the cross-level story, but it is completely a cross-level story. And the attention-based view paper is completely a cross-level story. And I think almost every paper that I've written is cross-level. I think, and this is something with respect to the last part of my speech, where I said, one of the problems I think in our field is people want to kind of, it's like we say, I think sometimes OMT calls us, we're the community of communities, but then it's sometimes hard to kind of cross communities, right? But this is my idea. Let's be open and let's think about, cross levels, because that's the world as it exists, right? That's the world that I see. That's the world I study. I mean, the very last paper that I published is in organization theory, the new journal, right? I don't know if you've seen that paper. It's called The Social Construction of Institutions, a Cross-Level Perspective. Mm-hmm. And it's basically arguing, well, social construction in Berger and Luckman, they don't talk about levels of analysis very much. You can interpret some of the things that they say from that perspective, but not the phenomenological perspective is more, flat in a way, right? There's no real levels in it. But in fact, if you think about how institutions develop over time, they start from kind of more micro level or meso level activities, right? And then there's organizations, fields and society. And these things are, there's also not just micro to macro effects, but macro to micro effects, right? Then meso to micro. And, all of these things I think are important, right? So just today I was teaching a class on organization design, and we talk about roles. Well, most roles that people have in organizations are not organizational level roles, right? They're roles that exist at the level of the field, right? And so that's kind of a macro to meso effect, right? So this thing happens all the time. And I think, for instance, one of the problems with the literature on org design is precisely that it ignored the cross-level effects, right? So the initial literature was all about organizational level design features, right? And then this institutional said, no, it's all about institutional features. But in fact, I mean, both perspectives are incomplete, right? Because there's macro to micro effects too. Over time, micro changes might affect the macro institutions, and there's always institutional variation also, right? So understanding these cross-level effects, and I would say, and I even from my undergraduate students today talk about, understanding these, that in fact, if we're going to assign roles, we have to think about, these are roles that they come from somewhere, right? So that's an example of a macro to micro effect that people haven't really studied very much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. And I particularly appreciate your point that we need to approach these things as cross-level phenomena, because they in fact are cross-level, right? You can choose to just take one level and slice it off from the rest, but you won't have a real understanding of what's happening. And so that made me think a little bit about your focus on doing transdisciplinary and also practitioner-oriented work, and trying to develop work that has real impact for people. So I'd love to hear more about your approach to that kind of work.
Well, this is the new William Ocasio, right? So since I joined the University of Illinois 3 years ago, kind of, I see this kind of a new stage in my career. And the Illinois Strategic Organization Initiative, I conceive of it is initially as an interdisciplinary approach, right? And I think, part of it is that I felt that I have one foot, the biggest foot is actually in OMT, but I also have, work in strategy, right? One of the reasons when I talk about attention to OMT folks is a lot of them don't know the attention work, right? they know the logics work, but I wanted them to see the connection too. But so I was looking at, well, these two fields should be much closer to each other than they are. But then coming to the University of Illinois, which is a land grant institution, which by definition is meant to be something that is directed also to the economic development of the state, right? This was part of the original law, et cetera. And by the way, they take it very seriously at Illinois, right? So that made me aware, well, wait a minute. And this goes back to my pre-PhD world. And even my thing that when I got to a PhD program, and I remember talking to Judge February, how come nobody in this department cares about management, right? I don't know if you want to quote me on that or not, but it's PhD students are not encouraged to, in organization theory, at least to care too much, at least about polite problems. By the way, and to the extent they are these days, are more kind of social problems, right? Which I think are important, right? But actually, the managerial level is, I think, actually strategy people do, but organizational people less so. Mm-hmm. But anyway, purpose was something that people at GEIS, the College of Business, care a lot about. So we adopted that as one of the sub-initiatives within ISOI. And then that's a subject that a lot of practitioners are interested in, but nobody completely knows what it means, right? So we had a conference that was for academics, and we then did a special issue that for academics in strategy science. But the ultimate objective is to, and we had already conversations, so we're having to actually make this more practitioner-oriented, because the problems that we are discussing are very much, first of all, the macro shifts that are happening are basically when you have, people like the Business Roundtable and the Larry Fink from BlackRock talking about we now have to think about purpose, right? So certainly there's a big, and now, there's a counter-purpose movement, if you will, in a political sense. So these are very practical issues, right? But I think this is something where academics, that we should not just talk to ourselves. The transdisciplinary is the way to think about how what we do transcends even our interdisciplinary interests, and also what might be interests of the more general population as a whole.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. So you alluded to your life before your PhD program, and I was hoping we could revisit part of your speech where you mentioned the central role of March and Simon in your intellectual journey. But you touched on how they helped you understand your experience working in the office of the governor of Puerto Rico. And so I was curious to hear more about that experience and how those theories applied in that context, what they shed light on that sort of clicked in for you.
Well, I guess I was how old was I? In my very early 30s, and I became executive director of the Governor's Economic Advisory Council, right? And I had no idea what I was getting into, because nobody told me what I was getting into, right? They told me about one thing, and that wasn't really what was going on, right? And I had like 4 different bosses who didn't necessarily get along with each other, right? So the power and politics part, I saw it very immediately. And for instance, this is related to my dissertation research, where it's like internal political struggles in organization and contests for power. They're not very public, right? So people, people wouldn't know that all these people are fighting with each other all the time. Who gets more power, more access to the government? That was the big deal, right? So I lived that, right? I also lived in, I served in one of the cabinets of the governor of Puerto Rico, right? And it was a very top-down attentional control from the governor, which very little bottom up, by the way, right? So these cabinets were really more about, okay, what's happening with this? Give me information. And the only lateral communication that would be happening was when, basically the governor asking a question and then they're related to some other cabinet member, right? Now, I was young and naive, and sometimes would raise my hand and speak about things, right? And got into trouble at some other times also because wait a minute, I didn't realize I didn't have the political capital to do this, right? I didn't have particularly the social capital. Anyway, so a lot of the things in my life are related in my career. I mean, are related to things that were in my prior work experience, and I think actually having some prior work experience is one of the things that allowed me to be where I am as a scholar, right? Because I had kind of some insights that you don't get only from reading books and tests. And by the way, that was also the case of institutional logics. So there's a book by Robert Jackal called Moral Mazes, which talks about institutional logic in the singular, right? And how they affect the decisions that are being made in organizations, some of them being crazy. Well, I went to the library in San Juan. I found that by coincidence. I found that book. I started to read it. I said, well, that's the world that I live in, right? And I'm not saying that people were immoral, but they were, because I don't think they were, but they were being very expedient, right? Which one of the things that that book talks about, right? And how that institutional logic made a lot of expedient action, which were not necessarily what they were pretending they were doing, right? So that is one of the things that even more than Freeland Alfred, it was Robert Jackal who kind of introduced me to the notion of institutional logic, right? And that's also about attention too, right? Because it's okay. How am I going to guide? What things am I going to attend to, given the logic that I'm part of, right? Even though I'm really supposed to do something else, right? Or pretending to do something else, right?
Yeah, that's great. And I love the story of finding the Moral Mazes book, which also had a big impact on me in graduate school. So you just touched on the importance of your prior work experience in shaping your work as a scholar. And I was hoping to
Can I add one more? Can I add one more?
Yeah.
The garbage can model.
Yes, please.
There was a lot of garbage can processes happening in the cabinet of the governor of Puerto Rico. And wait a minute, I can understand what the hell is happening here, right? Yes, I being in the room and raising my hand might change the direction of what happened, right? And you don't show up, then you're not gonna, so the participation angles were very clear, but also that there was a lot of kind of, happenstance, right? Is the word that I use, right? Not exactly, random, because you can explain everything why it happened, but it just happened to come. There's a combination of things that end up being quite significant in the point in time, right? Which is how I interpret the garbage can model, which, by the way, I think about it as a model of situated attention, and I talked about that in one of my chapters, in a chapter in the book on so yeah, so this is kind of like I had the education in my life working for 4 years and the governor of Puerto Rico.
Yeah. So I was wondering if you could tell us some advice that you have for graduate students who are developing a dissertation topic or research interest, how to think about pulling from their life experience as well as from the literature in order to sort of identify a fruitful direction.
Well, that I think is going to be highly variable, right? Depending on again what life experience they have, right? And by the way, I think there's an inverted U-shaped effect on too much. If you have too much work experience, then you're like too far from academia, right? I have people that have come to me. I'm tired of my job. I want to get a PhD, and you have no idea what you're getting into, right? So yes, I think particularly if you're a macro organizational scholar, I think having and particularly if you want to work at the organizational level, right? I would say it helps to have some like experience, right? Although that can be also just in like summer jobs, etc., right? Or I've seen somebody sometimes working things like case writing, right? Between an undergraduate and a PhD, and then not quite the same as life experience, but can also be quite helpful. But you have to just say where you are, right? And the other thing is that I don't know if I should say this, but getting there's the politics of the dissertation process, right? And you have to understand how that works in your department. Who are the professors who can help you be successful, can help you get a job. What are their preferences? Different professors have very different styles. Stanford was a place where they kind of left you on your own, which again, if you look at the Stanford graduates, and maybe you should not say this, but not put me on this. But there are issues where there's kind of more of a how shall I say? Is there like Northwestern was actually a mentoring model, right? Which, by the way, in this day and age is helpful because now people who don't have publications when they go on the market, it's hard to get a job. When I went on the market, I had 0 publications, right? And I got 4 job offers, right? That would be very difficult to do, including 3 in top schools, right? That would be highly unlikely to happen. So working more closely with dissertation advisors is useful. But I think I would say also, then there's the opposite effect that can happen, which is like they're so close to your advisors that you don't have the autonomy and independence, your independent voice. So one of the things that I do suggest is having maybe try to work with more than one person, right? Particularly if your school allows that, because then you can get different experience and combine them and have your own voice, right? But ultimately, it's also wherever it comes from, you have to be passionate about what you do. Right? Because this is a game of persistence, right? And most papers get rejected, right? So you have to really believe in what you're doing and then, go for it. Now you want to make sure that you get some validation early on that you're not just going on a completely, wrong track. And that's also what you use your advisors for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's grad school is a delicate balance between sort of pursuing things independently and making sure that people know what you're doing and that you're getting feedback and that you're able to incorporate it. So that's great advice. Thank you so much. So I was also hoping we could hear a little bit more about your reflections on OMT. You mentioned the deep roots you have in the division and the many years of service you've given to OMT. So I was curious to hear your thoughts on how OMT has evolved over the years and any new developments within OMT that you think are especially promising.
Well, those are two different questions. I think OMT is a very friendly division, right? It's very communal, right? There's a lot of people. It's a very welcoming group, right? Which I think is very positive. But I don't think the review process is that welcoming, right? So that's depends on what's happening in the academy might be a little different what's happening when you send things to the journal, right? So one of that is, develop. It is a highly networked group, right? And there are different networks, so it's both about understanding OMT, understanding the different sub networks in OMT, right? and making sure that you are, at least part of some networks is important, right? And some of that is not very clear particularly to young scholars or the doctoral students, right? Some of it is clear, but some of it is less so, right? I think institutional theory has become the dominant approach in OMT, I would say, right? As somebody who is partly an institution, I think it's good, but I also think that, you know, again, a little bit of these boundaries. Not everything in this organization is about institutional theory, right? I mean, but it's a little bit of it's not a bad thing in a way because um, you know, the world benefits from some combination of competition and collaboration, right? And we need to be aware of that, right? And we need to be aware of the importance of networks, and we need to be aware about the importance of common set of ideas and principles, right? I wish we had a more common language within OMT, right? That's where I think the pendulum has swung a little too far. Mm-hmm. I think I talked about the Pfeffer and Van Manen debate, right? Which I think Van Manen won, right? And I think I told you that I mentioned there that Pfeffer was my advisor and Van Manen was my senior. I think that the narrow band Pfeffer model was not the right way to go. But we've had perhaps there's a little bit too much differentiation these days, right? I think there's sometimes we need to think about sometimes people talking about the same thing with different labels, right? Or the same label talk about different things. I don't know. Maybe we need more textbooks. I recently, there's a pretty good one by, but it's about the sociology of organizations by Heather Haveman, right? But it's still about where these different perspectives, right? And it also doesn't cover some of the more meso stuff, right? That I'm interested in, right? So in a way, and this is a bit perhaps overambitious, but my bringing them attention control is one way. It's not the only. Doesn't cover everything, because as I said, it's not really a theory of evolution or of like performance really, although it can combine with other perspectives. But there's actually you can make a lot of connections between different theories. And for instance, I mentioned networks and attention. I think there's more connection there than perhaps the people realize or entertain, right? And yes, there's certain things like networks and institutions, and I would argue attention, but there are others that should be part of the kind of more general vocabulary, and we should think about not just about the camps, but also about how we can connect these different things. And I think this is starting to happen, right? I did mention the attentional networks in my speech. Also, that the very recent paper linking attention and hybridity also, right? So to me, if you talk about some of the kind of where I think is exciting for me, is precisely the people that are building bridges, because I think it's almost like, okay, there's not a lot of things that are completely brand new anymore. And if they are brand new, it's almost like relabeling the things that exist. So now I think there's a lot to be gained by, okay, let's try to connect these different perspectives. And what can we gain from that, right? And I think it's been not the easiest things for people to do. And I've seen them sometimes being a reviewer of papers, right? Either it doesn't get accepted or not. But I think, I mean, it's called organizational management theory, not theories. So there should be some connection at least, right? Even though there is specialization, or like in the, differentiation and integration, right? As a critical feature of organization, it should also be a critical feature of organizational theory. And I think the integration is where I think we're, in my view, that's at least it's still kind of not a lot, but that's what's most exciting to me about what's happening in organizational theory.
Amazing. So thank you so much for all of your thoughts and for sharing so much about your work and your perspective. Do you have any closing words for members of the OMT division or junior scholars?
Well, I would give a second answer to your last question, which does relate also to the cross-level work, and that is that org design is actually a really important issue. And it's a really important issue because what we know about organization design happened 30 years ago doesn't really apply very well to the modern world that we live in terms of all this innovation, certainly with the digital transformation, et cetera. I think there's a hunger for that. And I think the different theories of OMT can be used more of that, particularly if we're willing to do exactly the type of integration across different perspectives, right? So that's an area that has languished somewhat. Actually, now strategy people are doing more of that, although the strategy people tend to be strategy and organization folks. But also talking to practitioners, I feel like, wait a minute, I want some assistance in some of these issues of design, and this is something that, again, in a transdisciplinary way, we perhaps could do more. And it is, some of the institutional aspects do shape the org design, but it's not just purely bottom up. I mean, top down, right? So that's an area that I would encourage, that I think is, starting to become vibrant once again. There's even a journal of org design, but I would suggest that we should think about it. Networks are important to org design. Institutions, identity is part. People. Org design. One of the things that we think about is not just about the formal design aspects of the organization, but organizations can have major influences on informal organization, right? We can have influence on the culture. We can have influence on the networks, on the demography, and those interrelations are important. And I mean, the problem is they're hard to study, but there's things like configurational approaches. And maybe the very final thing that I should say is now we have a very new set of data and set of methodologies, even more than data, with natural language processing. And I myself, I'm working on a project right now with this amazing data on emails on Shield, Illinois, right? That we have access to all the emails. It's kind of a small organization, but it's amazing what you can get from that. But you only can really process it through some of these large language models, right? And people have been doing topic models for a while, but the new generations of models are so much better. So get to know some Python or work with people who know, and that's another direction that I think is important and exciting.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Willie. I really appreciate your time and sharing all this wisdom with the OMT division. Thank you so much.
Great, my pleasure. Good luck.